We understand the risks of Kel 37, and we accept the assignment. We will not fail the Council.
The compact gave humanity the worst planet in the sector, and everyone in that meeting room thought they were being clever. Designation Kel 37, toxic atmosphere, surface gravity at 1.4 standard, storms that lasted weeks, soil chemistry so hostile that nothing the compact's terraforming database recognized would grow there without decades of remediation first. It sat at the exact midpoint between three contested border regions, which meant it had strategic value nobody wanted to admit out loud, and habitability value low enough that offering it counted as generosity instead of insult. The Threll delegation proposed it during the territorial allocation talks specifically because they assumed humanity would refuse, and refusing would look bad on a species that had spent 2 decades building a reputation for taking on the difficult assignments nobody else wanted. Ambassador Noah Marovazic, 86 years old and technically retired from active service for the 3rd time, happened to be in that room as an advisor, and she watched the Threll representative make the offer with the specific careful neutrality of someone who'd built an entire career out of testing how far a trap could be set before someone noticed the teeth. Humanity's primary delegate looked at the planet's survey data for exactly 4 minutes. Then she said, "We'll take it." The Threll representative's expression, by every account from everyone in that room afterward, did not fully recover for the rest of the session. The assignment went to the UEDF's Colonial Development Division, who passed it to a planetary engineering team led by Dr. Amara Okonkwo Webb, 41 years old, granddaughter of the Marcus Webb who'd spent 8 days in a death trial canyon optimizing his calorie intake, and coming out the other side with 3 research contributions nobody had asked for. She'd inherited the family habit of treating impossible problems as systems to be understood rather than obstacles to be feared, and Kel 37 was, by every measure her team's initial assessment produced, about as impossible as planetary engineering problems got. The atmosphere wasn't just toxic, it was actively corrosive to most standard colonial infrastructure within 18 months of exposure. The gravity made every structure twice as expensive to build, and every piece of equipment worked twice as hard. The storms weren't survivable on the surface without shelter rated for conditions that didn't exist anywhere else in current compact engineering standards. Her team's first full assessment, 6 weeks in, concluded that conventional colonization wasn't viable within any timeframe shorter than 30 years. She read the assessment twice. Then she asked her team a different question, not how do we make this planet livable, but what does this planet actually have that nobody else wants, because they're only looking at what it doesn't have. It took her engineering team 4 more months to find the answer, and when they found it, it changed everything about how the project was framed. The corrosive atmosphere that made standard infrastructure fail within 18 months was, it turned out, the byproduct of an extraordinarily dense and chemically reactive mineral layer running through nearly the entire planet's accessible crust. A layer that, properly processed, produced some of the most efficient radiation shielding material the compact's engineering database had ever cataloged. The crushing gravity that made every structure twice as expensive to build also meant that anything built to withstand it was, by simple physical necessity, built to withstand almost anything else the galaxy could throw at it afterward. The storms that made the surface unsurvivable without specialized shelter generated, across the planet's extensive ionic disturbance bands, some of the most consistent and powerful natural electromagnetic activity ever recorded on an inhabited or inhabitable world. What looked on paper like 3 separate disqualifying flaws were, when examined as a connected system instead of 3 isolated problems, the raw materials for something nobody had ever needed to build before, because nobody had ever had a planet quite this committed to making survival difficult. Dr. Okonkwo-Webb's revised proposal, submitted 9 months after the initial assessment, was not a colonization plan. It was a fortress plan. Not a fortress in the dramatic sense, no weapons platforms, no offensive capability, nothing that violated a single compact treaty about military development in contested regions. A fortress in the oldest and most literal sense. A defensible position built from the planet's own hostility that turned every disqualifying weakness into a structural advantage. The corrosive mineral layer became the shielding material for every structure on the surface, mined and processed using equipment specifically engineered to survive long enough to do the job before the atmosphere degraded it, then replaced by structures that, once sealed, were nearly impervious to anything the compact standard sensor or weapons technology could throw at them. The crushing gravity became, instead of an obstacle, a foundation requirement that meant every permanent structure on Kel 37 was inherently more structurally sound than equivalent construction on any standard gravity world, because the engineering margins required to function at all exceeded the safety margins most other colonies built in by choice. The storms became a power source. The planet's relentless electromagnetic activity, once harnessed through atmospheric collection arrays that nobody else had ever needed to develop because nobody else had ever colonized anything this consistently violent, produced more raw energy per square kilometer than any other compact cataloged world, inhabited or not. 8 years after the Threll delegation handed humanity what they assumed was an insult, Kel 37 had a permanent population of 6,000, a fully self-sufficient power grid running almost entirely on storm capture, structural engineering standards that the Compact's own safety division eventually adopted as a baseline reference for high-stress environments, and a position at the exact strategic midpoint of 3 border regions that nobody, for any price, wanted to test by force. The planet's nickname, among the colonists who lived there and the engineers who'd built it, was simple and entirely earned. They called it the Anvil. The Threll representative who'd originally proposed the assignment, a careful proceduralist named Canvelthos who'd spent years building institutional relationships in the Compact Council, requested an official tour of the colony 11 years after the original allocation meeting, ostensibly as part of a routine review of border region development. Dr. Okonkwo-Webb, now the colony's senior planetary administrator, personally walked her through the facility. Canvelthos stood in the colony's central operations hub, looking at a structural readout showing load tolerances that exceeded anything in the Threll's own engineering standards by a significant margin, and asked the question that had apparently been sitting with her since the tour began. She said, "We gave you this planet because we thought it would humiliate you. Why didn't it?" Dr. Okonkwo-Webbs thought about it for a moment. She said, "Because you assessed the planet by what it lacked, we assessed it by what it had too much of. Those aren't the same question and they don't produce the same answer." Canvelthos said, "Every compact engineering assessment in our database said this world was unsuitable for habitation within any reasonable development timeline." Dr. Okonkwo-Webb said, "Every assessment was accurate by the standards it was measuring against. The problem was the standards assumed you wanted a planet that was easy. We didn't need easy. We needed a planet that was specifically, uniquely difficult in ways we could turn into something nobody else could replicate without going through the same difficulty first." Canvelthos said, "You're saying the hostility was the value." Dr. Okonkwo-Webb said, "I'm saying the hostility was the raw material. Value is what you do with raw material. Most species look at a planet like this and ask how to survive despite what it is. We asked what we could build because of what it is. Those are different engineering philosophies, and only one of them produces something like this." She gestured at the operations hub around them. 6,000 people living in structures more resilient than anything in the Threll's own colonial infrastructure, powered entirely by the same storms that had once made the planet's survey data red as a disqualifying hazard. Canvelthos was quiet for a long moment. She said, "The Council has been discussing, for the past 2 years, whether to request access to your structural engineering standards for use in our own high-stress colonial development." Dr. Okonkwo-Webb said, "We'd be glad to share them. We're not protective about the engineering. We're protective about making sure people understand why it works, not just how." Canvelthos said, "Why does that distinction matter?" Dr. Okonkwo-Webb said, "Because if you take the engineering without understanding the philosophy behind it, you'll apply it to the wrong planets, expecting the wrong results. The fortress design only works because we let the planet's own hostility define the engineering requirements instead of fighting against them. If you try to force this approach onto a world that doesn't have the right combination of disqualifying flaws to convert into strengths, you'll just build something expensive and brittle. The planet has to actually be this difficult, in exactly the right ways, or the whole approach falls apart." Canvelthos said, "How did you know?" "Kel-37 had the right combination." Dr. Okonkwo-Webb said, "I didn't know. My team spent 4 months looking before we found it. We didn't assume the planet had hidden value because we're optimists. We assumed it might have hidden value because every problem we'd ever inherited as a colonial division turned out to have some angle nobody had bothered looking for, usually because looking required admitting the first assessment might have asked the wrong question." She paused. "You handed us a planet you thought would embarrass us into either refusing the assignment or failing publicly at it. We looked at the same data your engineers looked at and asked a different question than they did. That's the entire difference. Not better technology, not more resources. A willingness to ask whether the thing that disqualified the planet for your purposes might qualify it for a purpose nobody had thought to want yet." Canvelthos looked out through the operations hub's reinforced viewport at the storm building on the horizon that would, within hours, feed directly into the colony's power grid the way it had every storm for the past 8 years. She said, "The Council assumed this assignment would demonstrate the limits of what your species could accomplish." Dr. Okonkwo-Webb said, "It did demonstrate something, just not the limits." Canvelthos said nothing for a while. Then she said, "I would like to formally request that the Threll delegation's records reflect an updated assessment of this colony's strategic and engineering value going forward." Dr. Okonkwo-Webb said, "We'd appreciate that, though I'll be honest, the colony doesn't need the Threll's approval to keep doing what it's already doing. We're not running this place to prove a point to anyone in that allocation meeting 11 years ago." Canvelthos said, "Then why are you telling me all of this?" Dr. Okonkwo-Webb said, "Because you asked an honest question and you came here in person instead of requesting a report. That's worth a real answer." The Threll's formal updated assessment, filed 4 months later, became the foundational document the Compact's engineering division used to develop an entirely new colonial classification system, one that evaluated potential settlement worlds not just for habitability, but for what the division began calling, in a direct translation from the original human engineering team's internal terminology, convertible hostility value. 11 other species submitted formal requests over the following 6 years to study the Kel-37 engineering model. Dr. Okonkwo-Webb's team shared everything every time with the same condition attached. They had to send their own engineers to actually walk the colony first, see the storms, feel the gravity, understand the philosophy before they got the blueprints. Because blueprints without the reasoning behind them had a way of becoming expensive mistakes on the wrong planet. 19 years after the original allocation meeting, when Dr. Okonkwo-Webb finally stepped down as senior administrator to train her successor, the colony's population had grown to over 40,000. Its power output supplied energy to 3 neighboring relay stations, and its structural engineering standards had become the compact-wide baseline reference for any colonial development in environments previously classified as unsuitable. At her retirement ceremony, held in the same operations hub where she'd once explained the entire philosophy to a thrilled diplomat who'd come expecting an apology and left with a research partnership, someone asked her what she wanted people to remember about the project. 20 years from now, when nobody left who'd lived through the original allocation meeting was still around to tell the story firsthand. She thought about her grandfather in a canyon, calorie counting his way through an 800-year-old trial nobody outside his species had ever survived. She thought about every story her family had ever told at every dinner table about difficult places, and the specific, unglamorous decision to look twice at a problem before accepting the first answer everyone else had already settled on. She said, "I want them to remember that we were handed the worst data anyone had ever measured a planet against, and instead of asking how to overcome it, we asked what it was actually good for. Every species in this sector has planets they consider worthless. I'd like the next generation to remember that worthless is usually just a measurement taken by someone who stopped looking too early." She looked out at the storm building on the horizon, same as it always did, feeding the grid the same way it had for 19 years. She said, "They gave us the worst planet in the sector because they thought it would break us." She said, "It just turned out to be the only planet hostile enough to need exactly what we were good at building."